Welcome everybody to the museum and this wonderful evening we have with our artist Steve Hilton. I'm Nick Nelson, I'm the director here. Since coming to the museum, I've been asking everybody I've run into, from people at the grocery store to people who visit the museum, what the museum needs, what are the things that we should be doing, what are the things that you want to see. And overwhelmingly, I hear we need something in the lobby. We need some color in the lobby. We're an art museum, and you walk in and there's just this big, white, expansive, sort of white, gray, and brown. And, we need art in the lobby. So we sat down and thought about it, and Sarah, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, had this wonderful idea of inviting artists in from around the nation to submit proposals to bring some really wonderful art and color into our lobby space. And the big challenge with the lobby is that it's full of light, which is not the friend of any artwork. Think about putting a newspaper on the dashboard of your car and leaving it there for a week and see what happens to that newspaper. It turns all yellow and nasty and crinkles up. Well, the same thing happens to any work of art, whether it be a painting or work on paper, when you put it in this beautiful space full of natural light. So that was our challenge: find some really beautiful, colorful artwork that will greet our visitors when they come into the lobby, and I think we did a really wonderful job. So right now I'd like to introduce our curator, Sarah Bohr, who will introduce our artist and move on with the evening.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you all for coming. We're so excited about this project, and I just want to tell you briefly about Steve, and then I'll let him tell you about his work. But Steve is a practicing artist and a full-time professor at Midwestern State University in Wichita Falls, Texas. He got his bachelor's degree here at our own Missouri State University in environmental geology, is that right? As well as a master's in art education, and he also has an MFA in ceramics from Arizona State. We're really excited to have his work here. As Nick said, it's the first in this inaugural lobby project. So every year we plan to have another work. So another reason to keep coming in, to see what changes and to see how each work interacts with that space. I think we picked a great work this year. We had over 50 entries, and so Steve was the best of all of those. On a personal note, he's been fantastic to work with. I think everyone on staff has grown to love him this week. He's been installing for the last few days. And so you've spoiled us. We expect every artist that comes to this project to be as great as you. So thank you, and Steve Hilton.
Thank you, Nick and Sarah. You guys have been great. And I have to say, I met one of the board members here a while ago. I think her name was Sally. And I want to say a few things about your art museum before I start. And what I'd like to say is the energy here is just incredible. And Nick, you should be really proud of what your staff does and is doing here. It's incredible. And board, you should be really proud of what you did hiring Nick. So anyway, another name And I can't, I have to thank Cindy for all of her help. Cindy was great, and all the other staff. You guys were really awesome, so I appreciate it. Also, I'm going to step back here for just a second. I don't like to stand back here, but I have a few other thoughts, and I don't want to forget them. Who am I? I was trained as a geologist right here at SNS, or Missouri State. And I've had several lives. I graduated with a degree in environmental geology, and decided a little later that I really was a teacher. And so I ended up getting a teaching job on a sailboat, on a gaff rig schooner, 140-foot schooner. And I taught math, English, science, and history, and sailing. And then I went on to teach up in St. Louis for 10 years. I taught astronomy, oceanography, environmental science, and I coached a couple of sports. And at one point in time, I ran a dive shop down in Tonga. Later on in my life, my wife and I decided that we wanted to move to somewhere where there were mountains, and we moved to Salt Lake City, Utah, where we taught snowboarding for a couple of years. And then it was my wife's turn to decide where we were going to live, and so she picked Alaska, and we moved to Alaska, where we taught up there, and did some snowboard coaching. We went to Greenland for a big competition. We were the snowboard coaches. And what else have I done? I ended up deciding, or I ended up getting a gift from my wife who couldn't be here because she's working. And the gift was at the age of 40 to be able to go get my MFA. And so I got to drop off the face of the earth, and I ended up going to Arizona State University where I earned my MFA in ceramics. And then taught for another year at the high school level. And then got the job where I have now, the job I have now in Wichita Falls, Texas, which is a great university, Midwestern State University, and it's just a little flat there. We don't have mountains, and we can't ride down the snow. So anyway, so that's who I am, and let's look at a little bit of work. Before we really start with my work, I'm going to show you a few images of where I get my inspiration. And so this is in Utah. If you haven't been to Utah, southern Utah, it's the absolute most, well, I can't say that. Alaska is the most beautiful, but Utah is a close second. And so these are some slot canyons in southern Utah. It's really beautiful. So here on the left is an amazing tree. Actually, the two trees, those were in China. Up the mushroom, that piece up there is from Myanmar. I've traveled a few places too. And this stuff all, it's what I look at for inspiration. It talks to me about my work. This was in Thailand, a piece of fungus. So I need to talk a little bit about being frugal and also thinking about how I come across what I make. It's a pretty big decision. Whenever I get to the point where I'm going to make a piece, knowing it's going to be a 4-month process, that's how long it took that piece to be made, about 4 months. But knowing I'm going to have 4 months into it, I have to be pretty sure that's what I want to do. And so I actually come to what I make a lot by serendipity. And in the case of the first pieces I'm going to show you, it was all about being cheap, being frugal. So I went to school at Arizona State. This is a process picture, and it doesn't look too interesting now. But I used to go to the undergraduate studios, and I would take the clay that they would throw away, and I would carry it back to my studio in 5-gallon buckets. And one day I got tired of cleaning out the buckets, so I lined the bucket with a plastic bag. And another time, I decided, what would happen if I were to take that plastic bag, squeeze all the excess clay out of it, and put it in the kiln? And so, this is what happened. This is what the material looks like. And this turned into this. And that, in turn, turned into this. This was in my MFA show down at Arizona State. I think there were about 150,000 individual pieces of clay all put in a bed of sand. And so this piece, or these pieces, have been installed, I don't know, 18, 19 times. I have a few images to show you of different places. This was in LA. This was in a gallery in Oklahoma. This was up in St. Louis. San Angelo, Texas. Phoenix, Arizona. And so I guess I'll stop here for a second and just talk about maturity and talk about process. From my point of view, every place or everything I did, it got a little better. And that's the way art happens, and that's the way it works. It was funny because I came here on Tuesday, and I put the piece that you guys have seen outside, I put half of it up. And after half of it was up, I decided it just wasn't the piece. And so I took it back down, and it was kind of fun watching people look at all that work come back off the wall. In fact, there were some people that they just shook their head, they didn't understand it, including my niece, who is down here, and she was helping me. And so she was, well, maybe a little upset with me because all that work just kind of went right out the window. But yeah, it's all about process, and it's all about how work matures. And so let me show you a few more pieces of this. This was in a gallery at Midwestern State University where I teach. And just to give you an idea of scale, I think it's about 25 feet by 18 or 19 feet. And I have a little bit of an obsession. And so if somebody gives me space, I was talking to Cindy about this, if somebody gives me a little space, I'll tend to step out of the bounds. Like they told me that I had to be at least 4 feet from the walls. I think I was 3 feet. But it's kind of just the way I am. So, yeah. Does anybody have any questions? I'd like for this to be informative, if anybody has a question at this point. Yes?
I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about scale relationships and where you see the viewer in these pieces in terms of the scale of the pieces.
Nice, nice. So, you know, with these particular pieces, it's kind of interesting. Like this one, for instance, I left that place in the middle for people to walk into. And it was important to me that people could and did actually walk into it. Maybe not so much as walk into it the way it did 5 minutes from the opening of the show. Less than 30 seconds of the opening of the show. Somebody was standing right about here, and somebody over there said, "Hey, George," and George stepped right about there. and it was. I always carry a paintbrush in my pocket to fix the sand because people have a tendency to see if it's soft. I'm kind of going around robin here to get back to answer your question, but it was really kind of nice because then people actually got to see how I made the piece and how I made the piece, and the process. But back to scale. Looking at the piece outside, I think a good way to think about it, or the way I think about it, is nature's a pretty large thing. It's something that I don't think most of us think about. And when we're out in nature, we have a tendency not to really understand where and who we are. And what I like to, or hope to think, is that after spending some time with my piece, and they are pretty large-scale pieces that people at least think about it a little differently. I don't know if that answered your question, but...
Well, I just sense the same scale relationship that takes place in some of the photographs that you were working from, some of the things you drew ideas from in Utah. I mean, it's like I'm looking over this and I sense a similar kind of scale relationship of you being, you know, in that space as well.
Okay, yeah. And that's kind of what I was trying to say, and I think you said it better, so thank you.
Not necessarily.
Something I'd like for you to notice in this image is the piece that's on the back wall back here. I'm going to talk a little bit about serendipity and how that piece came to be here in a second. So this is a close-up of that last piece. Another piece I'd like to talk about came from talk about scale. This is pretty large. This is Giants. No, this is Giants Causeway in Ireland. Has anybody ever been here? Or Devil's Tower? Okay, I'm seeing some yeses with Devil's Tower. So this is basalt. This is a volcanic material, and it just so happens that basalt, when it cools slow enough in the neck of a volcano, that it forms these hexagonal crystals. And these are actually, in geologic terms, these are crystalline. These are crystalline structures. And, so this greatly influenced the next piece. This next piece is about 9 feet by 6 feet. But pretty well process-oriented as well. These pieces were all extruded, hand extruded with an extruder, a clay extruder. And an interesting side story about this piece is I made the piece on about a 3 by 3 table, and so I never did see it until it was complete. I actually I built the first 2, and then I moved them over, and I built the next 2 next to it, and then I had to take the first 2 off, and so you can imagine. And it never was together until it was complete. I'd like to say that this is something that I did, but it's not. It's really quite amazing. It's another piece of fungus. I think this is a picture I took down in Costa Rica. And it's really quite amazing. And as a sculptor, well, as myself as a sculptor, I'm not necessarily trying to recreate nature, but I want people to think about it. And there's no way that an artist could sculpt this. It's incredible. But I sure would like to try to do some of this. So this next piece is the beginnings of the piece that you guys actually have seen out in the gallery out here. This is sandcast glaze. And the sandcast glaze's technique is something that I'm sure somebody else has used in the past, but I came across it again, a serendipitous way. I used to build these very large-scale sculptures that weighed 400, 500 pounds, and I built them in the kiln because they were so heavy I didn't want to move them. And I would fire them in the kiln, I would open the kiln back up, I would glaze them in the kiln, close it back up, and really only move them once they were finished. Well, if you know anything about clay, or I'll explain, clay shrinks whenever it's fired, whenever it dries and then is subsequently fired. And the clay that I was using was shrinking about 14%. If you don't allow the clay to slide a little bit, it was breaking the legs off of these great big tripoded pieces. And so what I started doing was putting sand underneath the pieces, so the sand would act like a ball bearing, or ball bearings if you will, and it would allow the clay to shrink. One time I spilled some glaze in the sand, and I thought, well, I don't feel like cleaning that up. I'm just going to wait and see what it does. And so I left it in the kiln, and out came this jewel that the fire created. And I had a very small hand in it, but it was really quite beautiful. And so just to give you an idea about the process, I used to make pieces such as this one out here, very similar to what you see here in these process pictures. This is a kiln. The black pieces or parts are made of stoneware. And what I would do is I would put them in the kiln, bury them in sand up to the point where I wanted the glaze to be. And then I would literally pour 3/4 of an inch to an inch of glaze around the black piece up above the sand, fire it, and whenever it cooled, after it was a molten material, it would cool into these hardened little geodes, if you will. And so that piece became this. This piece is actually, the intention, it was supposed to be on one wall about 120 feet. And I was kind of baited and switched. I went to the gallery and I was going to install it, and they said, we'd rather have this on this other wall, or these 3 walls. And it made it a very different piece. So much so that some people told me that it was kind of threatening in this sense. And there was no intention for it to be threatening. My vision, my thought, this came from my background in oceanography. This came from sea anemone. It came from something that's very non-threatening, from coral. And yeah. So another serendipitous thing happened when I took this off the wall. I'll show you that picture here in a second. So this is another sandcast glaze piece. This is the original is a little bit smaller than what you see here. We had a big kiln in Arizona State. So that last piece that I showed you that I was talking about, it was on the wall, whenever I took it down, I just happened to put it in a big pile on the floor. And I actually liked it a lot better on the floor. I think it was a much more successful piece on the floor.